The office was locked from the inside. The window was open. The boss never came home. When the cleaning crew arrived at Hillman & Associates Monday morning, they found the third-floor corner office sealed tight, deadbolt engaged. But the window behind the desk was wide open. Rain had soaked the carpet. The chair was pushed back. And Marcus Hillman, the firm's senior partner, was gone. The contradiction is this. The window latch requires you to be inside the room to unlock it. The door requires a key to lock from the outside. So how do you leave a locked room through an open window on the third floor, with no fire escape, no ledge, and no disturbance to the flower bed below? I'm a freelance investigative journalist. I have covered financial fraud cases before, and when the local paper mentioned this disappearance in a 2-paragraph blurb, I knew the details didn't fit. So I started asking questions. What I found was a timeline that tightens like a noose, a key that belongs to nothing, and a small-town accounting firm where everyone had access. But no one admits to using it. The firm sits on the edge of a commercial district, the kind of place where storefronts give way to office parks, and the streets empty out after 6. Hillman & Associates handles small business accounting, tax prep, some light auditing. 12 employees. Quiet reputation. Marcus Hillman had run it for 19 years. He was last seen Friday evening, just after 7. His assistant, Joanna Kress, said he told her to go home, that he'd lock up. She left. The building's keycard log shows no other exits that night. The security camera in the hallway outside his office went dark at 7:14. The system logged it as a power interruption, but the rest of the building stayed lit. When I arrived Tuesday morning, the police had already taped off the third floor. I spoke with Detective Lydia Brennan, a careful woman in her 40s who chose her words like she was reading from a script. She told me they were treating it as a missing person case, not a crime scene. But her eyes kept drifting to the window. I asked her about the key. She hesitated, then pulled an evidence bag from her jacket. Inside was a single brass key, small, old-fashioned, with a worn grip and a stamped number on the shaft, 47. It had been found on Hillman's desk, lying on top of a stack of client files. No one at the firm recognized it. It didn't match any lock in the building. Hillman's wife said she'd never seen it before. Detective Brennan told me they'd checked the window for prints. Clean. They'd checked the ledge outside for scuff marks or rope burns. Nothing. They'd searched the office for signs of struggle. The room was orderly. Hillman's computer was still on, password screen glowing. His coat was draped over the chair. His phone was in the desk drawer, powered off. The rain started that night and hadn't stopped. I asked Brennan if anyone else had a key to the office. She said yes. Joanna Kress, the assistant, and Tom Wardle, the building maintenance supervisor. Both had been interviewed. Both had alibis. But when I pressed her on the details, she just said the investigation was ongoing. That's when I knew she was holding something back. I spent the next 2 days digging into Hillman's background. He was 52, married, 2 adult children, no criminal record, no obvious debts. But when I pulled his firm's public filings, I found something odd. 3 clients had terminated their contracts in the past 4 months. All of them were small construction companies. All of them left without explanation. I reached out to one of them, a man named Carl Ridley, who ran a residential framing business. He agreed to meet me at a diner off the highway. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from not sleeping. I asked him why he left Hillman and Associates. He stirred his coffee for a long time before answering. He said Marcus had been handling his books for 6 years. No problems. Then in late spring, Ridley noticed a discrepancy in his quarterly tax filing. Nothing huge, just a few line items that didn't match his records. When he asked Marcus about it, Marcus said it was a clerical error and promised to fix it. But when Ridley checked the amended filing, the error was still there. Different numbers, same problem. Ridley said he didn't want to make a fuss, so he just moved to another accountant. But then he heard 2 other contractors had done the same thing. Same timeline, same vague discomfort. I asked him if he ever saw a brass key in Marcus's office. He frowned. He said no. But then he added something that stuck with me. He said Marcus had started locking his file cabinet around that time, the tall one in the corner. Before that, it was always open. Ridley had noticed because he'd needed a copy of an old invoice once, and Marcus had made him wait while he unlocked it. I went back to the office building that evening. The police tape was still up, but the 3rd floor was empty. I found Tom Wardell in the basement, running a power diagnostic on the security system. He was a broad man in his 60s, methodical, the kind of guy who labels his tools. I asked him about the camera outage. He said it wasn't an outage. The camera had been manually disabled. Someone had accessed the breaker panel in the utility closet and flipped the switch. The timestamp on the breaker log showed 7:13, 1 minute before the camera went dark. But the utility closet requires a key. Only 2 people had copies, Wardell himself and Marcus Hillman. I asked him if anyone else could have made a duplicate. He said sure, if they had access to the original. But the key was supposed to stay in the maintenance office, locked in a drawer. Wardell checked after the police asked. The key was there, no sign it had been disturbed. I asked him if he'd been in the building that Friday night. He said no. He'd left at 5. His wife confirmed it. They'd driven 2 hours north to visit her sister. He didn't get back until Sunday morning. But here's what he didn't say. He didn't ask me why I was asking. He didn't seem surprised that the camera had been disabled. He just answered my questions and went back to his diagnostics. I pulled the building's keycard access log for the week leading up to Marcus's disappearance. Most of it was routine, employees swiping in between 8 and 9, swiping out between 5 and 6. But there were 3 entries that didn't fit the pattern. All 3 occurred after midnight. All 3 used Marcus Hillman's keycard. Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Each time, the log showed entry at 12:47 and exit at 2:16. An hour and a half. Middle of the night. No explanation. I called Detective Brennan and told her what I'd found. She was quiet for a moment, then said they'd already reviewed the logs. She thanked me for my diligence and reminded me not to interfere with an active investigation. But she didn't tell me to stop. The next morning, I went to see Joanna Kress. She lived in a duplex near the river, the kind of neighborhood where people keep their blinds closed. She answered the door in a cardigan and jeans, holding a mug of tea. She looked younger than I expected, mid-30s, with the careful posture of someone who's used to being watched. I told her I was looking into Marcus's disappearance and asked if she had a few minutes. She let me in. The living room was tidy, almost sterile. She sat on the edge of the couch and didn't offer me a seat. I asked her about the last time she saw Marcus. She said it was Friday, just after 7. He'd been working late all week, sorting through client files. She'd offered to stay and help, but he told her to go home. He seemed distracted, she said. Not upset, just distant. Like he was working through something in his head. I asked her if she'd ever seen the brass key. Her expression didn't change, but her hands tightened around the mug. She said no, she'd never seen it. But then she added something that made me sit forward. She said Marcus had been asking her strange questions in the days before he disappeared. Questions about the file cabinet, whether she'd ever opened it, whether she'd noticed anything missing. I asked her if she had a key to the cabinet. She said no. Only Marcus had one. I asked her if she knew what was inside. She looked at me for a long time, then said she didn't. But her voice was too steady, too rehearsed. I asked her about her alibi for Friday night. She said she'd gone home, made dinner, watched television. Alone. No one to confirm it. I asked her if the police had searched her apartment. She said no. They hadn't asked. I left Joanna's place with more questions than answers. The brass key didn't fit any lock in the building. The security footage had been manually disabled. Marcus had been working alone, late at night, accessing the building at odd hours. And Joanna, his assistant, was lying about something. I went back to the office building one more time. This time I brought a locksmith, a guy I'd worked with on a previous case. I told him I needed to know what the brass key opened. He examined it under a jeweler's loupe, turning it slowly, checking the teeth and the shaft. He said it was old, probably 1970s or 80s. The style suggested a filing cabinet or a desk drawer. He said if I could find the lock, he could tell me for sure. I thought about the file cabinet in Marcus's office. The one Carl Ridley said had started being locked. The one Joanna had been asked about. I called Detective Brennan and told her I thought the key might belong to the cabinet. She said they'd already checked. The cabinet had a different lock. But I asked her if they'd checked inside the cabinet, if they'd looked for a hidden compartment or a false bottom. There was a long silence on the line. Then she said she'd look into it. 2 hours later, she called me back. Her voice was tight, controlled. She said they'd found something. A secondary lock, hidden in the back panel of the bottom drawer. The brass key fit. Inside was a leather folder containing photocopies of altered tax documents, spreadsheets with highlighted discrepancies, and a handwritten list of names. All of them clients. All of them contractors. Marcus Hillman had been documenting fraud. But the question was, his own or someone else's? And the second question, the one that kept me awake that night, if he was gathering evidence, who the folder changed everything? Detective Brennan brought me in to review the documents. Not officially, but quietly. She met me at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the station, slid a manila envelope across the table, and told me I had 20 minutes. Her face was drawn, the kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing a case is worse than you thought. I opened the envelope and spread the pages out. The first thing I noticed was the handwriting. Neat, methodical. The kind of penmanship you see in engineers or architects. Every entry was dated. Every discrepancy was circled in red ink. The earliest entry was from March. The most recent was from the Thursday before Marcus disappeared. The pattern was clear. Someone had been systematically skimming from client accounts. Small amounts spread across multiple businesses, always below the threshold that would trigger automatic audits. A few thousand here, a few hundred there. Over 6 months, it added up to nearly $70,000. But here's what made my stomach drop. The spreadsheet included internal account numbers, routing codes, transaction timestamps, information that only someone with direct access to the firm's financial systems could obtain. This wasn't an outside hack. This was inside the building. I asked Brennan if she'd identified a suspect. She said not yet. But the documents suggested Marcus had narrowed it down to 2 possibilities. On the back page of the folder, in the same careful handwriting, were 2 names underlined in red. Joanna Kress and Philip Dominici. Dominici was the firm's junior accountant, 31 years old, hired 18 months ago. I hadn't spoken with him yet. Brennan said he'd been out of town the weekend Marcus disappeared, visiting family in Pennsylvania. His mother confirmed it. His credit card showed purchases in Pittsburgh, but the timeline was tight. He'd left Friday afternoon and returned Monday morning. Just enough window to be somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. I asked Brennan why Marcus would suspect his own assistant. She hesitated, then said Joanna had access to everything. She processed client payments, maintained the filing system, handled correspondence. She also had the door code to Marcus's office, though she claimed she rarely used it. But the keycard log showed 3 late-night entries on her card over the past 2 months. Each time, the entry was logged between 11 and midnight, hours after the office officially closed. When Brennan asked her about it, Joanna said Marcus had asked her to retrieve files he'd forgotten. Emergency requests, always by text. But when they pulled Marcus's phone records, there were no texts to Joanna during those time windows. No calls either. Joanna changed her story. She said she must have misremembered. Maybe it was emails. But the emails didn't exist either. I asked Brennan if they'd searched Joanna's computer. She said they had. Nothing. Clean browser history, clean file directories. No unusual downloads. Either Joanna was innocent, or she was very, very careful. I finished reviewing the documents and handed the envelope back. Brennan told me to stay close. She said the case was about to move fast. She was right. That afternoon, the forensic accountant hired by the firm released a preliminary report. The skimming had been more extensive than the folder suggested. Over 9 months, nearly $110,000 had been diverted. but the trail had been expertly obscured, routed through shell accounts and dummy invoices, layered in a way that made it difficult to trace without Marcus's annotations. The accountant identified one additional detail. The most recent transaction had occurred Thursday night, less than 12 hours before Marcus disappeared. $5,000 moved from a client escrow account into an external holding account, registered to a limited liability company with a generic name, Streamline Solutions, LLC. When they traced the LLC, the registration led back to a post office box in a neighboring county. The listed agent was a name no one recognized, David Feller. No social media presence, no phone listing, no employment history. The Secretary of State's office confirmed the LLC had been registered 4 months ago, filed online, paid with a prepaid debit card. A ghost. I started pulling at that thread. I drove to the post office, a small branch in a strip mall 20 minutes west. The clerk checked the box number. No mail. The box had been rented in June, paid for 6 months up front, also with a prepaid card. The clerk remembered the man who'd rented it. Average height, dark jacket, sunglasses, baseball cap. Paid in cash. Didn't make small talk. I asked if there were security cameras. The clerk said yes, but the footage was only kept for 30 days. This was mid-October. The June footage was long gone. I went back to the office building and found Philip Dominici at his desk. He was thin, pale, with the nervous energy of someone who drinks too much coffee and doesn't sleep enough. When I introduced myself and said I was looking into Marcus's disappearance, his hands started shaking. I asked him how long he'd worked at the firm. He said 18 months. He'd been hired to help with the overflow during tax season and stayed on full-time. He said Marcus was a good boss, fair, detail-oriented. He seemed genuinely shaken by the disappearance. I asked him if he'd noticed anything unusual in the weeks before Marcus went missing. He said Marcus had been quieter than usual, more distracted. He'd started locking his office door during the day, even when he was inside. Dominici said he'd knocked once to ask a question, and Marcus had taken almost a minute to answer. When the door finally opened, Marcus looked rattled, like he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. I asked Dominici if he knew about the financial discrepancies. His face went white. He said no. He said he only handled individual tax returns and small business filings. The client accounts were managed by Marcus and Joanna. He didn't have access to the main ledger. I asked him if Marcus had ever questioned him about his work. He paused, then said yes. About 3 weeks before the disappearance, Marcus had asked him to pull his access logs, the record of which files he'd opened and when. Dominici said it felt like an audit, but Marcus framed it as a routine security review. Dominici gave him the logs. Marcus thanked him and never mentioned it again. I asked Dominici where he was the night Marcus disappeared. He said he'd left work at 4:30 Friday, driven to Pittsburgh to see his mother. He'd stayed through Sunday, then driven back Monday morning. He showed me gas station receipts, a restaurant charge, a toll road timestamp. The alibi was airtight. But here's what bothered me. Dominici was too eager to prove it. He'd pulled the receipts from his wallet before I even asked for them, like he'd been expecting the question. I thanked him and left. As I walked out, I glanced back through the glass door. Dominici was on his phone, his back turned, speaking quickly. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but his posture had changed. The nervousness was gone. He looked focused, deliberate. I sat in my car and called Brennan. I told her about the conversation, about Dominici's reaction, about the phone call. She said she'd follow up. Then she told me something that made my chest tighten. They'd found Marcus's car. It was parked in a long-term lot near the regional airport, 2 towns over. The attendant said it had been there since Friday night, around 9. The ticket stub was still on the dash. No signs of disturbance, no luggage in the trunk. But the glove box had been opened, the contents scattered across the passenger seat, registration, insurance card, a folded map, and a small notebook. The notebook was the key. It was the same size and style as the one Marcus used for client meetings, the kind with a leather cover and gridded pages. But this one was different. Every page had been torn out, cleanly, carefully, leaving only the perforated edge. Someone had removed the evidence. Brennan said they were processing the car for prints. But the interior was clean, wiped down. No prints on the wheel, the door handles, the dash. Whoever had driven it there had been careful. I asked her if Marcus had any reason to go to the airport. She said no. His wife confirmed he had no trips planned. His credit cards showed no airline purchases. His passport was still at home. The car was a dead end. Except for one thing. In the trunk, wedged into the spare tire well, they found another brass key. Same style, same worn grip, same stamped number, 47. Identical to the one found on Marcus's desk. 2 keys. Same number. One in the office, one in the car. But the lock only needed one. So why make a copy? I drove out to the airport lot that evening and walked the perimeter. It was a small regional hub, mostly commuter flights and cargo. The parking lot was well lit, cameras on every other pole. I found the attendant, a college kid working the night shift, and asked him about the security footage. He said the cameras covered the entrance and exit lanes, but not the individual parking spaces. They could see cars coming and going, but not what happened once they were parked. I asked if I could review the entrance footage from Friday night. He said I'd need a warrant or permission from the airport authority. I called Brennan. She said she'd request it. 2 days later, the footage came through. I watched it on Brennan's laptop in her office. The grainy black and white feed showing cars pulling in and out. At 8:53 Friday night, Marcus's sedan entered the lot. The driver's face was obscured by the visor, but the build and posture matched Marcus. The car proceeded to the long-term section and disappeared from view. At 9:41, a figure walked out of the lot toward the terminal. Dark jacket, hood up, hands in pockets. The camera angle made it impossible to see the face. The figure walked with purpose, not hurried, but deliberate. At the terminal entrance, they turned left toward the rideshare pickup zone, and vanished into the crowd. Brennan rewound the footage and paused on the clearest frame. The figure's stride was smooth, unhurried. The jacket was a common style, black nylon, no visible logos. The shoes were dark sneakers, generic brand, nothing identifiable. I asked Brennan if they'd pulled rideshare records for that time window. She said yes. 3 pickups within 10 minutes of 9:41. One was a family of 4. One was an elderly couple. The third was a single passenger, male, requested an address in the north end of town, paid cash on arrival. The driver described him as quiet, average build, didn't make conversation. The drop-off point was a convenience store 6 blocks from Marcus's house. When police checked the store's security footage, the figure never entered. They walked past the store and disappeared down a side street. Brennan said they'd canvassed the neighborhood. No one saw anything. No ring doorbells, no witnesses, no trace. I asked her if Marcus's wife had noticed anything unusual that night. Brennan said Diane Hillman had been out of town. She'd driven to visit her daughter at college Thursday afternoon and didn't return until Sunday. Marcus had told her he'd be working late all weekend, that he had a backlog to clear. She'd texted him Friday night around 10 to say goodnight. He'd responded, "Still at the office. Love you." But Marcus wasn't at the office. His car was at the airport. And someone else had sent that text. Brennan pulled the phone records. The text to Diane had been sent from Marcus's phone at 10:03. The cell tower ping placed the phone near the office building. But the keycard log showed no one entering or exiting the building between 7:30 and 6 the next morning. So how did the phone get there? I asked Brennan if they'd found Marcus's phone. She said no. It hadn't pinged since Friday night. Either the battery died, or someone destroyed it. I spent the next day reconstructing the timeline. At 7:14 Friday night, the security camera outside Marcus's office went dark. At 7:30, Marcus's keycard logged an exit. At 8:53, his car arrived at the airport. At 9:41, someone left the airport on foot. At 10:03, Marcus's phone sent a text from near the office. The sequence didn't make sense. If Marcus drove to the airport, who brought his phone back to the office? If someone else drove the car, where was Marcus? I went back to the office building and walked the route from Marcus's office to the parking garage. It took 4 minutes. I timed it 3 times, same result. If Marcus left at 7:30, he could have been at the airport by 8:30, accounting for traffic, but that left a 23-minute gap before the car entered the lot. Where was he during that window? I checked the route for stops, gas stations, ATMs, fast food, anything with cameras. Most of the route was residential, minimal surveillance. But there was one intersection with a traffic camera, halfway between the office and the airport. I called the city traffic department and requested footage. They sent it over that afternoon. At 8:09, Marcus's car passed through the intersection, heading west toward the airport. The driver was alone. The angle made it impossible to confirm identity, but the license plate matched. So Marcus was driving, alone. No sign of coercion. But that raised a new question. If Marcus drove himself to the airport, got out and walked to the terminal. Why did he lock his office from the inside and leave the window open? Unless he didn't. I called the locksmith again and asked him a hypothetical. If you wanted to make it look like someone left through a window, but they actually left through a door, how would you do it? He thought for a moment, then said you'd need 2 people. One person leaves through the door, locks it from the outside using a key. The second person stays inside, opens the window, and then leaves later through a different exit. But the building only had one exit that bypassed the keycard system, the loading dock in the basement. It was used for deliveries, controlled by a manual push-bar lock. No keycard required. No cameras. I went back to Tom Wardell and asked him if anyone had used the loading dock that Friday night. He checked his logs. The dock was supposed to be locked after 6. But when he'd done his rounds Monday morning, he'd noticed the push bar was loose, like someone had forced it from the inside. He'd assumed it was a maintenance issue and tightened it. He hadn't reported it. I asked him if he'd seen anything unusual in the basement that weekend. He said no. But then he added something that stopped me cold. He said when he'd gone down to check the breaker panel Saturday morning, he'd noticed a smell. Faint, chemical, like cleaning solution. It was near the loading dock door. He'd thought maybe the cleaning crew had spilled something, but the cleaning crew didn't work weekends. I called Brennan and told her to get a forensic team to the loading dock. She said they'd already cleared the basement. I told her to check again, specifically the area near the push-bar door. They found it 3 hours later, trace blood evidence, cleaned but not eliminated. Luminol lit up a faint smear on the concrete floor, about 6 feet from the dock door. The pattern suggested transfer, not spatter, like something had been dragged. The DNA came back in 2 days. It was Marcus Hillman's blood. Now we knew Marcus hadn't left through the window. He'd left through the basement. And he hadn't left alone. The blood evidence changed the investigation from a missing person case to a probable homicide. Detective Brennan assembled a task force. 2 additional detectives, a forensic team, and a prosecutor from the county office who specialized in financial crimes. They set up a command center in the police station's 2nd floor conference room, walls covered in timeline charts and photographs. I was allowed to observe, not officially, but Brennan trusted my instincts. She told me I'd earned it by finding the loading dock lead. But she also warned me, if this went to trial I couldn't be a witness and a journalist. I'd have to choose. I told her I'd cross that bridge when we came to it. The forensic team processed the basement for 3 days. Beyond the blood smear, they found fiber evidence, black nylon threads caught in the push-bar mechanism, consistent with the jacket worn by the figure in the airport footage. They also found a partial shoe print near the loading dock. Size 10, common tread pattern, likely a mass-market athletic shoe. Not enough for a definitive match, but enough to narrow possibilities. The working theory was this. Marcus had discovered the embezzlement, documented it, and confronted someone. That someone had lured him back to the office Friday night, attacked him, and moved his body through the basement. They'd then staged the locked office and open window to create confusion, bought time by driving Marcus's car to the airport, and disappeared into the night. But the theory had holes. The biggest one: motive for the staging. If you've already killed someone and moved the body, why go to the elaborate trouble of locking the office from the inside and opening the window? Why not just leave the door unlocked and make it look like Marcus left normally? Unless the staging wasn't about Marcus, it was about buying time to do something else. I kept coming back to the brass keys. 2 identical keys, both stamped 47. One found on Marcus's desk, one found in his car. The key opened a hidden lock in the file cabinet, the lock that secured the folder documenting the fraud. But if Marcus already had one key, why make a duplicate? I asked Brennan if the forensic team had checked the file cabinet for tampering. She said they had. No signs of forced entry. The lock was intact. But when they inventoried the contents, they found something odd. The folder Marcus had hidden was still there. Documents in order. Nothing missing. But underneath the folder, in the very back of the compartment, there was an empty space. Dust patterns suggested something rectangular had been stored there. Something about the size of a ledger or a laptop. Whatever it was gone. I started thinking about access. Who knew about the hidden compartment? Marcus, obviously. But if he'd shown someone the folder, if he'd confronted them with the evidence, they would have known about the compartment too. And if they'd killed him, they'd have wanted to remove anything else that might incriminate them. But here's the problem. The compartment required the brass key to open. Marcus had one key on his desk. The duplicate was in his car. So how did the killer access the compartment after Marcus was dead? Unless they'd made a third key. I called the locksmith and asked him if it was possible to duplicate the brass key without the original. He said yes, if you had the lock. You could disassemble it, measure the pin configuration, and cut a key to match. It would take time and skill, but it was doable. Alternatively, if you had access to the original key for even a few minutes, you could make an impression in clay or wax, and use that to cut a duplicate. I asked him how long the impression method would take. He said 5 minutes to make the mold, a day to cut the key if you knew what you were doing. I thought about the timeline. Marcus had been asking Joanna about the file cabinet in the days before he disappeared. He'd been working late, accessing the building at odd hours, compiling evidence. If Joanna was involved, she would have known something was wrong. She would have needed a way to access whatever Marcus was hiding. But Joanna's alibi for Friday night was weak, not non-existent. She'd been at home, alone, no one to confirm it. The cell tower records placed her phone near her apartment all evening, unless she'd left the phone behind. Brennan brought Joanna in for a second interview. I watched through the one-way glass. Joanna sat with her hands folded, calm, controlled. She was dressed professionally, like she was heading to work, not a police interrogation. When Brennan asked her to walk through Friday night again, Joanna repeated the same story. She'd gone home, made dinner, watched television, went to bed around 11. Brennan asked her if she'd left her apartment at any point. Joanna said no. Brennan asked her if anyone had visited. Joanna said no. Brennan slid a photograph across the table, the fiber evidence from the loading dock. She asked Joanna if she owned a black nylon jacket. Joanna said yes. Lots of people did. Brennan asked if she'd bring the jacket in for comparison. Joanna said she'd thrown it out 2 weeks ago. It had a torn pocket. She'd replaced it. Brennan asked where she'd thrown it out. Joanna said the dumpster behind her building. Trash pickup was Tuesdays. The jacket was long gone. Convenient. Brennan shifted tactics. She asked Joanna about the late-night keycard entries, the ones that didn't match any calls or texts from Marcus. Joanna maintained she'd been asked to retrieve files, that Marcus must have called from the office landline. Or maybe she'd misremembered and he'd asked her in person earlier. Brennan asked why Joanna hadn't mentioned the landline before. Joanna said she hadn't thought of it until now. Brennan asked for the specific files Joanna had retrieved. Joanna paused, then said she didn't remember. It had been months ago, just routine client folders. Brennan asked if Joanna had ever made a copy of the brass key. Joanna's expression didn't change. She said she didn't know what key Brennan was referring to. Brennan showed her the evidence photo, the brass key on Marcus's desk. Joanna said she'd never seen it before. Brennan asked if Joanna had ever opened the file cabinet in Marcus's office. Joanna said no. She didn't have a key. Brennan asked if Joanna knew the cabinet had a hidden compartment. Joanna said no. Brennan let the silence stretch. Joanna didn't fidget, didn't look away, didn't fill the space with nervous chatter. She just waited. Finally, Brennan thanked her for her time and said she was free to go. But as Joanna stood to leave, Brennan added one more thing. She asked Joanna not to leave town. Joanna said she didn't have any plans to travel. Then she walked out. I met Brennan in her office 20 minutes later. She looked frustrated, the kind of frustration that comes from knowing someone is lying but not being able to prove it. I asked her if she believed Joanna's story. She said no. But belief wasn't enough. They needed evidence. And right now, everything they had was circumstantial. The fiber evidence was generic. The shoe print was common. The keycard entries could be explained. The jacket was gone, without a body, without a witness, without a definitive forensic link. They had nothing that would hold up in court. I asked her about Philip Dominici. She said they'd cleared him. His alibi was solid. His financials were clean. He had no connection to the shell company, no motive to harm Marcus. Unless he was working with someone else, he was off the board. That left Joanna. And Tom Wardell. Wardell had been on my mind since the beginning. He had access to every part of the building. He knew the security systems. He could disable cameras, access the loading dock, move through the space undetected. And he'd been oddly calm when I'd questioned him, like he'd expected the interrogation. But Wardell's alibi was also solid. 2 hours away, visiting his wife's sister, confirmed by multiple witnesses. Unless he'd driven back, which would have been tight but possible. The distance was 130 miles. If he'd left his sister-in-law's house around 6, he could have been back at the office by 8. Attacked Marcus, staged the scene, driven to the airport, returned to the office to send the text, and driven back north. He'd need to be back at his sister-in-law's by early morning to maintain the alibi. It was a stretch, but not impossible. Brennan said they'd pulled Wardell's cell records. His phone pinged towers near his sister-in-law's house all weekend. No gaps, no movement. If he'd driven back, he'd left his phone behind, just like Joanna might have. We were chasing ghosts. I spent the next week digging into Streamline Solutions LLC, the shell company that received the embezzled funds. The registered agent, David Feller, remained a phantom. No employment history, no property records, no digital footprint. The name was likely fake, a placeholder. But money leaves trails. I contacted a forensic accountant I'd worked with before, a woman named Lisa Trent, who specialized in corporate fraud. I sent her the transaction records from Marcus's folder and asked her to trace the flow. She called me back 3 days later. She said the money had moved through 3 intermediary accounts before landing in a personal checking account at a regional bank. The account was opened 6 months ago under the name Rebecca Soller. Lisa pulled public records. Rebecca Soller was a real person, 73 years old, living in a nursing home 2 counties over. She had Alzheimer's. Her power of attorney was held by her nephew, listed as Jeffrey Soller. Lisa ran Jeffrey Soller's information. No criminal record. No obvious connection to Marcus Hillman or the accounting firm. But when she cross-referenced his employment history, one entry stood out. Jeffrey Soller had worked as a data entry clerk for a payroll processing company 4 years ago. The company handled accounts for small businesses, including contractors. I called Lisa and asked her if any of the contractors Marcus worked with used that payroll company. She checked. 2 of them had, including Carl Ridley, the man who'd noticed the discrepancies and left Hillman and Associates. The connection was thin, but it was there. Someone with access to payroll data could have identified targets, understood their financial patterns, and exploited the system. I asked Lisa if Jeffrey Soller was still employed by the payroll company. She said no. He'd been fired 3 years ago for policy violations. The company wouldn't provide details, but the timing suggested a performance or ethical issue. I passed the information to Brennan. She pulled Jeffrey Soller in for questioning. He was 34, wiry, with the defensive posture of someone who'd been questioned by authorities before. He admitted to opening the account under his aunt's name, but claimed it was for managing her finances, not fraud. He said he had no connection to Streamline Solutions LLC and had never heard of Marcus Hillman. Brennan asked him to provide bank statements for the account. Jeffrey said he'd need to talk to a lawyer first. That was enough for a warrant. The bank statements showed deposits matching the embezzled amounts, timed to the transaction dates in Marcus's records. But the money hadn't stayed in the account. It had been withdrawn in cash over the course of several weeks, always in amounts just under $10,000 to avoid federal reporting requirements. Classic money laundering. Brennan arrested Jeffrey Soller on fraud charges, but when she pressed him on Marcus's disappearance, he shut down. He said he didn't know anything about a missing person. He wanted a lawyer. The interview ended. The prosecutor reviewed the case and determined they had enough to charge Jeffrey with embezzlement and identity theft. But without evidence linking him to Marcus's death, the homicide case remained open. I went back to the office building one more time. I walked through the basement, stood near the loading dock, tried to reconstruct the sequence. Marcus had been attacked near this door, blood evidence confirmed. Someone had dragged or carried him out. But to where? The loading dock opened onto a service alley behind the building. The alley was shared by 3 businesses: the accounting firm, a dental office, and a print shop. Dumpsters lined one side. Security cameras covered the dental office's back entrance, but not the accounting firm's dock. I checked with the dental office. Their cameras faced their own door, angled away from the alley. No useful footage. The print shop didn't have cameras. But the alley led to a side street, and the side street intersected with a main road that had a traffic camera. I requested footage from the city for the Friday night time window. It took 4 days to process. When the footage arrived, I watched every vehicle that passed through the intersection between 8 and midnight. Most were personal cars, easily dismissed. A few delivery trucks, logged and cleared, and one panel van, white, no visible markings, driving slowly south at 9:17. The van wasn't suspicious on its own, but the timing fit. If Marcus was attacked around 7:30 and his car left for the airport at 8:50, the van leaving at 9:17 could have been transporting the body while someone else handled the car. I asked Brennan to run the plate. The van was registered to a commercial cleaning service based 30 miles away. The company confirmed the van had been reported stolen 2 weeks before Marcus disappeared. It was recovered a week after, abandoned in a grocery store parking lot, wiped clean. Another dead end. But also confirmation. Whoever did this had planned carefully. Stolen vehicle, no forensic evidence, precise timing, coordinated roles. This wasn't impulse. This was calculated. I sat down with Brennan and mapped the logistics. The crime required at least 2 people, possibly 3. 1 person to attack Marcus and move the body. 1 person to drive Marcus's car to the airport. 1 person to return to the office and send the text from Marcus's phone. The roles could overlap if the timing was managed carefully, but it was tight. Joanna and Jeffrey made sense as a pair. Joanna had access, knowledge, and opportunity. Jeffrey had the financial motive and the skills to set up the shell company. But we had no evidence they knew each other. No phone records, no financial transactions, no social media connections. Unless they were careful about that too. I started looking for indirect links. Joanna's social media was minimal. A Facebook account with privacy settings locked down. An Instagram with a dozen photos of generic landscapes and coffee cups. No tags, no followers of interest. Jeffrey's accounts were similarly sparse. But people leave traces in other ways. I pulled property records, utility bills, vehicle registrations. Joanna rented her duplex. Jeffrey lived in an apartment complex on the other side of town. No overlap. Then I checked employment history. Joanna had worked at Hillman & Associates for 6 years. Before that, she'd been an administrative assistant at a law firm. Before that, a receptionist at a medical clinic. Standard progression, nothing unusual. But the medical clinic caught my attention. It was a family practice, small, the kind of place that handles routine checkups and minor procedures. I called and asked if they kept employment records going back 7 years. They did. I requested Joanna's file, citing the active investigation. The clinic administrator was hesitant but cooperative. She sent over a PDF, hire date, termination date, job duties, performance reviews, and a reference check form. One of Joanna's references had been a former co-worker named Angela Pryor. I ran Angela's name through public records. She'd moved out of state 5 years ago, currently living in Ohio. I called her. Angela remembered Joanna. She said they'd worked together for about a year, got along fine, lost touch after Angela moved. I asked Angela if Joanna had any close friends or relationships during that time. Angela thought for a moment, then said there was a guy Joanna used to talk about. They'd met online, some kind of financial advice forum. Joanna had mentioned him a few times, said he was helping her understand investment strategies. Angela didn't remember his name, but she remembered Joanna saying he worked in payroll or accounting, something like that. I asked Angela when this was. She said around the time they both worked at the clinic, so 7 years ago. 7 years ago, Jeffrey Soller was working at the payroll processing company. I called Brennan and told her to pull archive records for online financial forums active 7 years ago. It was a long shot, but if Joanna and Jeffrey had connected digitally, there might be a trail. Usernames, posts, private messages. Brennan assigned a digital forensics specialist to the task. It took 2 weeks, but they found it. A forum called InvestSmart, archived after the site shut down 5 years ago. The archive included public posts and, critically, metadata showing private message activity. 2 usernames appeared repeatedly in private exchanges: Planner Joe and Data Jeff. The messages were cautious, never explicitly incriminating, but the topics were telling. Discussions about financial loopholes, how to move money undetected, how to exploit small business accounting systems. The tone was collaborative, almost playful. The last archived message was from 6 years ago. Planner Joe wrote, "Going quiet for a while. New job. Let's keep this offline." Data Jeff replied, "Smart. I'll do the same. We'll stay in touch." The forensics specialist traced the usernames. Planner Joe's account was created using an email address that matched Joanna Kress. Data Jeff's account was created using an email address that matched Jeffrey Soller. We had the connection. Brennan moved fast. She brought Joanna back in for a 3rd interview, this time with the forum evidence on the table. I watched from behind the glass again, but the atmosphere in the observation room had changed. 2 prosecutors stood with me now, along with the lead forensic specialist. Everyone knew this was the pivot point. Joanna arrived with a lawyer this time, a sharp woman in her 50s named Patricia Voss, who specialized in white-collar defense. Voss sat close to Joanna, a yellow legal pad in front of her, pen ready. When Brennan entered and placed the printed forum messages on the table, Voss barely glanced at them. Brennan started simply. She asked Joanna if she recognized the username Planner Joe. Joanna looked at her lawyer. Voss nodded slightly. Joanna said yes. She'd used that name years ago on a financial advice forum. She'd been trying to learn about investing. There was nothing illegal about that. Brennan asked if she recognized the username DataJeff. Joanna hesitated, then said she remembered exchanging messages with several people on the forum. She didn't remember specific usernames. Brennan slid a highlighted excerpt across the table. It was from a private message thread, Planner Joe to DataJeff. Small business owners never check the details. They trust their accountants completely. That's the vulnerability. Brennan asked Joanna to explain what she meant by that. Voss cut in. She said the message was years old, taken out of context, and didn't constitute evidence of wrongdoing. She advised Joanna not to answer. Brennan moved to the next excerpt. If you're careful about the amounts and spread it across enough accounts, the software doesn't flag it. I've seen it happen. Brennan asked Joanna if she'd seen embezzlement happen, or if she'd done it herself. Voss repeated her advice. Joanna stayed silent. Brennan leaned forward. She said they had evidence connecting Jeffrey Soller to a shell company that received over $100,000 embezzled from Hillman and Associates clients. They had evidence that Joanna and Jeffrey had discussed financial fraud in detail years before Joanna started working at the farm. And they had evidence that Marcus Hillman had discovered the scheme and documented it in the days before his disappearance. Brennan asked Joanna directly, "Where is Marcus Hillman?" Voss put her hand on Joanna's arm. She said her client had no knowledge of Marcus Hillman's whereabouts and wouldn't be answering questions about a separate investigation without immunity guarantees. Brennan said immunity wasn't on the table. This was a homicide investigation now. Voss's expression didn't change, but I saw Joanna's fingers tighten around the edge of the table. For the first time, she looked afraid. Brennan continued. She said the blood evidence, the staged crime scene, the coordinated logistics, all pointed to premeditation. This wasn't a panicked reaction. This was planned. And in this state, conspiracy to commit murder carried the same penalty as murder itself. She gave Joanna a choice. Cooperate now. Tell them what happened, and the prosecutor might consider a plea. Or stay silent and face the full weight of the evidence when it went to trial. Voss called for a break. Brennan stepped out. In the observation room, the prosecutors debated strategy. One argued they had enough to arrest Joanna on the embezzlement charges and pressure her from custody. The other said they should wait, keep building the homicide case, make the offer more appealing. Brennan came into the observation room and asked my opinion. I said Joanna was careful. She'd stayed quiet this long because she believed she could outlast the investigation. But the forum messages had rattled her. She hadn't expected that connection to surface. If we were going to break her, it had to be now, while she was off balance. Brennan nodded. She went back into the interview room. She sat down across from Joanna and Voss and said she wanted to be clear about something. She said they knew Joanna didn't act alone. They knew Jeffrey Soller was involved. And they knew someone had helped move Marcus's body and stage the scene. Right now, both Joanna and Jeffrey were facing the same charges. But the first person to cooperate would have leverage. The second person would have nothing. She let that sit for a moment, then added, Jeffrey Soller was in custody. He had his own lawyer. And that lawyer was probably having the same conversation right now. It was a bluff. Jeffrey's lawyer hadn't offered anything. But Joanna didn't know that. Voss asked for another break. This time, she and Joanna spoke in the hallway for nearly 20 minutes. When they came back, Voss said her client was willing to provide a statement in exchange for a written immunity agreement covering the homicide charges. She would plead guilty to conspiracy to commit embezzlement and provide full cooperation regarding Marcus Hillman's death. The prosecutors huddled. They didn't want to give full immunity, but they needed the information. They counted. Joanna would plead to conspiracy to commit embezzlement and accessory after the fact to manslaughter. If her testimony led to a conviction, the sentencing recommendation would be lenient. If she lied or withheld material facts, the deal was void. Voss conferred with Joanna. After a long pause, Joanna nodded. The prosecutors drafted the agreement. Everyone signed. And then Joanna started talking. She said she met Jeffrey Soller on the InvestSmart forum 7 years ago. They'd bonded over frustration with how easy it was for people with access to exploit financial systems. It started as theoretical discussion, almost academic. But over time, it became more concrete. When Joanna got the job at Hillman and Associates, she saw an opportunity. The firm was small, the oversight was minimal, and Marcus Hillman trusted her completely. She had access to client accounts, billing systems, and the internal ledger. Jeffrey had the technical knowledge to set up shell companies and move money without triggering alarms. They started small, a few $100s here and there, spread across multiple clients, always below audit thresholds. They used prepaid cards, burner emails, and intermediary accounts to obscure the trail. Over 18 months, they'd moved nearly $110,000. Joanna said Marcus didn't notice at first. But around March, one of the clients, Carl Ridley, flagged a discrepancy. Marcus started reviewing accounts more carefully. By late summer, he'd found the pattern. Joanna said Marcus confronted her in early October. He didn't accuse her directly, but he asked pointed questions about file access, late-night entries, and client billing. She denied everything, but she knew he was closing in. She contacted Jeffrey. They agreed they needed to stop, erase the trail, and disappear the evidence. But Marcus was meticulous. He'd been documenting everything. And Joanna knew he kept sensitive files in a locked cabinet in his office. She needed to access that cabinet. Joanna said she'd noticed the brass key on Marcus's desk a few weeks earlier. She didn't know what it opened, but Marcus had been protective of it, moving it from his desk to his pocket whenever he left the room. One afternoon, while Marcus was in a meeting, she took the key, pressed it into a clay mold she'd prepared, and returned it within 3 minutes. She gave the mold to Jeffrey, who cut a duplicate. When Marcus confronted her, she realized he'd hidden the evidence somewhere she couldn't easily access. She suspected the file cabinet. She used the duplicate key one night after hours, found the hidden compartment, and discovered the folder documenting the embezzlement. But there was something else in the compartment, a backup hard drive. Marcus had been keeping digital copies of everything: client records, transaction logs, emails, notes. If that drive reached the authorities, Joanna and Jeffrey were finished. She told Jeffrey. They made a plan. Joanna said the plan was simple at first. convince Marcus to meet her at the office Friday night, late, after everyone had gone. She'd tell him she wanted to confess, to explain her side, to negotiate. Marcus agreed. He was a reasonable man. He believed in second chances. But when Marcus arrived at the office that night, Jeffrey was waiting in the basement. Joanna's voice wavered as she described what happened next. She said Marcus came in through the main entrance just after 7. She met him in his office. They talked for a few minutes. She apologized, said she'd made mistakes, asked if there was a way to resolve it without involving the police. Marcus said he'd already contacted an attorney. He was filing a formal complaint Monday morning. He said he was disappointed, but he couldn't protect her. The evidence was too clear. Joanna said she panicked. She texted Jeffrey, a pre-arranged signal. Jeffrey came up from the basement through the internal stairwell. He entered the office, and Marcus recognized him immediately from the payroll company connection. Marcus realized it was bigger than just Joanna. Jeffrey told Marcus they needed the hard drive. Marcus refused. He said it was already in the hands of someone safe, someone who would release it if anything happened to him. Joanna said she didn't know if that was true. But Jeffrey didn't believe it. He demanded Marcus open the file cabinet. Marcus refused again. That's when it turned physical. Joanna said Jeffrey pushed Marcus. Marcus pushed back. They struggled near the desk. Jeffrey grabbed a heavy glass paperweight, the kind with a firm logo embedded inside, and swung it. The paperweight connected with the side of Marcus's head. Marcus went down hard. Joanna said there was blood. Not a lot at first, but enough to know it was serious. Marcus wasn't moving. Jeffrey checked for a pulse. He found one, but it was weak. Joanna said she froze. She didn't know what to do. Jeffrey told her they had to move him, get him out of the building, figure out what to do next. He said if they called for help, they'd both go to prison. If they moved fast, they could contain it. Joanna said she didn't argue. She was terrified. She helped Jeffrey drag Marcus to the service elevator, down to the basement, out through the loading dock. They used the stolen panel van Jeffrey had parked in the alley. They loaded Marcus into the back, and Jeffrey drove away. Joanna stayed behind. She went back upstairs, wiped down the office, staged the scene. She locked the door from the inside, opened the window, and left through the basement loading dock. She walked 3 blocks to where she'd parked her car earlier, drove home, and waited. Jeffrey texted her 2 hours later. He said it was done. He didn't say where he'd taken Marcus or what had happened. Joanna said she didn't ask. Brennan stopped her. She asked Joanna if Marcus was alive when Jeffrey drove away. Joanna said she didn't know. She thought so, but she wasn't sure. Brennan asked where Jeffrey took Marcus. Joanna said she didn't know. Jeffrey never told her. She said it was better that way. If she didn't know, she couldn't tell anyone. Brennan asked about the hard drive. Joanna said Jeffrey went back to the office later that night, used the duplicate key to access the file cabinet, and took the drive. He destroyed it. She didn't know how. Brennan asked about Marcus's car, the airport, the text message. Joanna said that was Jeffrey's idea. He drove Marcus's car to the airport to create a false trail, make it look like Marcus had left voluntarily. He walked back into town, took a ride share to near the office, retrieved Marcus's phone from the car earlier, sent the text to Marcus's wife from near the building to ping the right cell tower, then destroyed the phone. Brennan asked if Joanna had been in contact with Jeffrey since Marcus disappeared. Joanna said no. They'd agreed to cut all communication. No calls, no texts, no meetings. They'd gone completely dark. Brennan asked if Joanna had any idea where Marcus's body was. Joanna shook her head. She said Jeffrey had access to a lot of places through his old work connections. Warehouses, storage units, construction sites. She said he'd mentioned once, years ago on the forum, that the best way to dispose of evidence was to hide it in plain sight. Somewhere it would be destroyed naturally over time. One of the prosecutors asked what that meant. Joanna said she thought it meant somewhere with industrial activity, demolition, landfill, something that would churn and bury. Brennan looked at me through the glass. I knew what she was thinking. We had Joanna's confession. We had the connection to Jeffrey, but without a body, without physical evidence tying Jeffrey to the murder. A defense attorney could argue Marcus was still alive, that this was all a financial cover-up, that Joanna was lying to reduce her own sentence. We needed the body. Brennan ended the interview and placed Joanna in custody. Then she brought Jeffrey Soller back in, this time with the full weight of Joanna's statement. His lawyer tried to shut it down, but Brennan played the recording of Joanna describing the attack, the basement, the van. Jeffrey's face went pale. His lawyer called for a break. They conferred for an hour. When they came back, the lawyer said Jeffrey was willing to cooperate, but only if the state took the death penalty off the table. The prosecutors agreed. Jeffrey would plead guilty to second-degree murder and provide the location of Marcus Hillman's body. Jeffrey said he'd driven Marcus to an industrial park 40 minutes north, a place where he'd done contract work years ago. There was a demolition site, an old factory being torn down. Heavy equipment, piles of rubble, minimal security. He'd taken Marcus there, and Marcus had died in the van from the head injury. Jeffrey said he'd panicked, dragged the body into the debris field and buried it under concrete slabs and steel beams. He said the demolition continued over the following weeks. By now, the body was under tons of compacted rubble, scheduled to be hauled to a landfill. Brennan sent a forensic team to the site the next morning. The demolition had been completed, but the rubble was still on site, waiting for transport. It took 3 days of careful excavation, but they found Marcus Hillman's remains under 6 feet of broken concrete. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with Joanna's account. Marcus had been dead before Jeffrey even left the industrial park. The staged office, the airport, the text message, all of it had been theater. A desperate attempt to buy time and create confusion. The case closed quickly after that. Joanna pled guilty to accessory after the fact and conspiracy to commit embezzlement. She received 12 years. Jeffrey pled guilty to second-degree murder and embezzlement. He received 30 years without parole. The firm dissolved. The clients sued the estate. Diane Hillman, Marcus's widow, received a settlement from the firm's malpractice insurance, but it didn't cover the emotional cost. I spoke with her once, a few months after the trial. She said the hardest part wasn't the violence or the betrayal. It was knowing Marcus had died alone, trying to do the right thing, and no one had been there to help him. I filed my story 6 months later. It ran in a long-form investigative series, picked up by a few national outlets. The brass key became a symbol in the coverage, the small object that unlocked everything. But for me, the key was never the point. The point was access. Joanna had access to Marcus's trust, his files, his routines. Jeffrey had access to financial systems, stolen vehicles, industrial sites. Together they had access to a plan that almost worked. Almost. Because Marcus had done one thing they hadn't accounted for. He'd documented everything. He'd built a case so thoroughly that even after his death, the evidence led us straight to the truth. In the end, Marcus solved his own murder. I kept a copy of the case file. Sometimes I pull it out and look at the photograph of the brass key, stamped with the number 47. I think about the hidden compartment, the duplicate key, the moment Joanna pressed it into clay and set everything in motion. And I think about the window, the open window in the locked office, the detail that started it all. It was a distraction, a piece of theater meant to confuse and delay. But it did the opposite. It made us look harder. It made us question everything. That's the thing about staging a crime. The more elaborate the deception, the more places it can fall apart. One loose thread, and the whole thing unravels. Marcus knew that. He built his case carefully, methodically, the same way he'd built his career. And even though he didn't live to see justice served, his work finished the job. Detective Brennan retired a year after the trial. She told me the Hillman case was the one that made her realize she'd done enough. She'd seen too many bodies, too many families destroyed by greed and fear. She moved to the coast, bought a small house, and stopped answering her phone. I understand why. Tom Wardell still works at the office building, though it's under new management now. Different tenants, different security systems. I ran into him once at a hardware store. He asked if I was working on any new cases. I said no. I was taking a break from true crime. He nodded, said that was probably smart. Then he asked if I thought Joanna had been telling the truth. If she really didn't know where Marcus was going to end up. I said I believed her. I think she convinced herself that if she didn't know, she wasn't responsible. People do that. They draw lines in their minds, create boundaries that let them sleep at night. Wardell said he'd been thinking about that a lot. About the lines people cross and the ones they won't. He said the night Marcus disappeared, he'd driven back from his sister-in-law's place earlier than he'd told the police. Not to the office, just to the edge of town. He'd had a bad feeling, he said. Couldn't explain it. He'd sat in a gas station parking lot for an hour, trying to decide if he should check the building. But he'd convinced himself he was being paranoid. He drove back north and tried to forget about it. I asked him if he thought he could have stopped it. He said probably not. But he'd never know, and that was the part that kept him awake. I think about that conversation sometimes. About the moments when we sense something wrong, but talk ourselves out of acting. About the instincts we ignore because they don't fit neatly into our routines. Marcus Hillman's murder wasn't inevitable. There were a dozen points where it could have gone differently. If Carl Ridley had pushed harder on the discrepancies. If Marcus had gone to the police immediately instead of building his case alone. If Joanna had walked away from Jeffrey years earlier. If Jeffrey had chosen not to swing the paperweight. But none of those things happened. And so Marcus died in a van in an industrial park, and his body was buried under rubble, and his wife spent months not knowing if he was alive or dead. That's the real horror of cases like this. Not the violence itself, but the cascade of small decisions that lead to it. The incremental compromises. The rationalizations. The moment when someone decides their fear is more important than someone else's life. I don't cover true crime anymore. This case was the last one. I still get calls from detectives sometimes asking if I want to consult on new investigations. I always say no. Because the truth is, I'm tired of walking into basements and finding blood. I'm tired of sitting across from killers and listening to them explain why they had no choice. I'm tired of telling families that we found their loved one. But it's too late. Marcus Hillman deserved better. He deserved to file his complaint, to see Joanna and Jeffrey prosecuted, to rebuild his firm and his reputation. He deserved to go home to his wife, to see his grandchildren grow up, to retire someday and look back on a life well lived. Instead, he got a glass paperweight to the skull and a shallow grave in a demolition site. And the people who killed him got to walk around for weeks, pretending to be concerned, pretending to search, pretending they didn't know exactly what had happened. That's the part that stays with me. The performance. The careful control. Joanna sitting in that interview room with her hands folded, answering questions like she was discussing someone else's tragedy. Jeffrey manufacturing alibis and moving money and destroying evidence like it was just another project to manage. They were good at it. They almost got away with it. But Marcus was better. He built a case that couldn't be ignored, couldn't be buried, couldn't be explained away. And in the end, that's what brought them down. The brass key, stamped 47. The hidden compartment. The folder full of evidence. The hard drive Jeffrey destroyed too late. Because the folder was enough. Marcus knew someone might come for him. He knew he was putting himself at risk. But he documented everything anyway. Because that's who he was. Methodical. Thorough. Unwilling to let the truth stay hidden. I visited his grave once, about a year after the case closed. It's in a small cemetery on the west side of town, near a stand of oak trees. The headstone is simple. Marcus J. Hillman, beloved husband and father, 1971 to 2023. I stood there for a while, listening to the wind move through the branches, and I thought about the last thing Diane Hillman told me. She said Marcus used to say that accounting was about more than numbers. It was about accountability, about making sure things added up, about refusing to let discrepancies slide, because discrepancies meant someone was lying. She said he believed in that. He built his career on it. And in the end, it got him killed. But it also got him justice. I don't know if that's enough. I don't know if justice ever really balances the scales. But it's what we have. It's what Marcus left behind. That, and a brass key with the number 47 stamped into the shaft. A small object that opened a hidden lock and unlocked everything else. I think about that key sometimes. I think about how something so ordinary, so easily overlooked, can become the center of everything. How a piece of metal stamped with a number can hold the answers to questions no one knew to ask. And I think about the people who cross the lines, who make the choices, who decide that money or fear or self-preservation is worth more than another person's life. They're not monsters. That's the uncomfortable truth. They're people like Joanna and Jeffrey, people with jobs and apartments and social media accounts and coffee orders. People who blend in, whose smile at Naig the trial lasted 3 weeks. I sat in the gallery every day, taking notes, watching the prosecutors lay out the case piece by piece. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, with high windows that let in cold October light. The same kind of light that had been falling the day Marcus disappeared. Joanna's trial went first. Her attorney, Patricia Voss, mounted a defense centered on coercion and diminished capacity. She argued that Jeffrey Soller had manipulated Joanna, that the online relationship had been predatory, that Joanna had been a victim herself. She brought in a psychologist who testified about patterns of control in digital relationships, about how trust could be weaponized. It was a calculated strategy. If the jury believed Joanna had been manipulated, they might accept the accessory plea as appropriate. They might see her as someone who'd made terrible choices under pressure, not someone who'd planned a murder. But the prosecution had the forum messages, and those messages told a different story. The lead prosecutor, a man named Raymond Kelch with 20 years of experience, walked the jury through the archive. He displayed the messages on a screen, highlighted the key phrases. Small business owners never check the details. The software doesn't flag it. If you're careful about the amounts. He asked the jury to consider the tone. Was this someone being manipulated, or was this someone actively participating in planning fraud? He brought up the clay mold, the duplicate key, the fact that Joanna had accessed Marcus's office after hours multiple times without his knowledge. He asked the jury, does that sound like someone acting under duress, or someone acting with intent? Voss countered with character witnesses. Joanna's former co-workers from the medical clinic, her landlord, a woman from her church. They all described her as quiet, helpful, reliable, someone who volunteered at community events, someone who donated to local charities. Kelch asked each witness the same question on cross-examination. Did Joanna ever mention Marcus Hillman? Did she ever mention that her boss had been murdered and buried in a demolition site? None of them had known. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They came back with a guilty verdict on all counts. Joanna sat motionless as the verdict was read, her hands folded in her lap, the same posture she'd held in the police interview. But this time, when the judge announced the sentence 12 years, Her shoulders dropped, just slightly, enough to notice. Diane Hillman was in the courtroom that day. She sat in the front row, flanked by her daughter and son. When the verdict was read, she didn't react. She just stared straight ahead, her face carved from stone. Afterward, outside the courthouse, a reporter asked her how she felt. She said she didn't feel anything. She said feelings required energy, and she didn't have any left. I understood that. Jeffrey's trial was shorter. His attorney, a public defender named Marcus Chen, tried to argue that the death had been accidental, that Jeffrey had only intended to scare Marcus, not kill him. But the medical examiner's testimony was damning. The force required to cause the skull fracture Marcus sustained was significant. This wasn't a shove or a stumble. This was a deliberate strike, with a heavy object. Chen tried to introduce doubt about whether Jeffrey had been the one to swing the paperweight. Maybe it had been Joanna. Maybe Marcus had fallen and hit his head. Maybe the injury happened later, during transport. But the forensic evidence contradicted all of it. Blood spatter analysis showed the injury occurred in the office, near the desk, exactly where Joanna had described, and Joanna's hands had tested negative for blood residue, while Jeffrey's clothing, recovered from his apartment, showed trace amounts consistent with close proximity spatter. Jeffrey had been there. Jeffrey had swung the weapon. Jeffrey had killed Marcus Hillman. The jury took 4 hours to convict. 30 years without parole. Jeffrey's face didn't change when the sentence was read. He'd known it was coming. His only visible reaction was a slight nod, like he was confirming a calculation. Chen asked for a sentencing delay to prepare an appeal. The judge denied it. Jeffrey was remanded immediately. As the bailiffs led him out, he glanced at the gallery. His eyes found mine. I don't know if he recognized me, if he knew I'd been the one to find the loading dock evidence, the forum connection, the thread that unraveled everything. But he held my gaze for a moment, and I saw something in his expression that I hadn't expected. Regret. Not for Marcus, not for the crime, but for the mistake, for getting caught, for believing he was smarter than the evidence. That look stayed with me for months. After the trials, I went back to the office building one last time. It was late November, the air cold and sharp, the kind of weather that makes you walk faster. The building had new tenants now, a software startup and a marketing firm. The accounting office on the 3rd floor was empty. The space listed for lease. I walked up the stairs, stood in the hallway outside what used to be Marcus's office. The door was propped open. The room had been cleared out, repainted, the carpet replaced. No trace of what had happened here, except for the window. It was closed now, locked, the latch secure. But I could still picture it the way the cleaning crew had found it. Open, rain soaking the carpet, the chair pushed back. The staging had been clever. It had bought Joanna and Jeffrey time, created confusion, forced the investigation to consider multiple possibilities. But it had also been their undoing. Because the staging didn't make sense, and things that don't make sense draw attention. If they'd just locked the door normally, left the window closed, made it look like Marcus had left for the airport voluntarily, the investigation might have taken weeks longer to find the loading dock. might never have found the blood evidence, might have treated this as a missing person case indefinitely. But they got elaborate. They tried to create a locked room mystery, and in doing so they created questions that demanded answers. I think Joanna had watched too many crime shows. She'd convinced herself that misdirection was smart, that the more confusing the scene, the harder it would be to solve. But real investigations don't work like puzzles on television. They work through evidence, through blood and fibers and timestamps and mistakes. And Joanna and Jeffrey had made mistakes. The clay mold had left microscopic residue on the brass key. The stolen van had been captured on 3 different traffic cameras. The forum messages had been archived by a third-party backup service neither of them knew existed. Jeffrey's old co-worker at the payroll company remembered him asking about shell corporations and offshore accounts. Joanna's cell phone, even though it stayed near her apartment, showed a gap in activity during the exact window when Marcus was attacked. Small things, but enough. I met with Diane Hillman one more time, about 6 months after Jeffrey's sentencing. She'd invited me to her house, said she wanted to thank me properly. I told her it wasn't necessary, that I'd just been doing my job. She insisted. Her house was modest, a ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where people mow their lawns on Saturdays and wave to their neighbors. Inside, the walls were covered with family photos. Marcus and Diane on their wedding day, their kids as children, graduations, holidays. She made coffee and we sat in the living room. She asked me about the investigation, about the moment I'd realized what had happened. I told her about the brass key, about the way it kept appearing in places it shouldn't, about how that persistence had led to everything else. She said Marcus was like that, persistent. When he believed something was wrong, he couldn't let it go. She said it was one of the things she'd loved about him, but also one of the things that had worried her. Because persistence can be dangerous when you're pursuing people who have something to lose. I asked her if Marcus had ever mentioned feeling threatened. She said no. He'd told her about the discrepancies, about the investigation he was conducting, but he'd framed it as a professional issue, not a personal risk. He'd said he was being careful, keeping detailed records, making sure everything was documented. He'd said if anything happened, the evidence would speak for itself. And it had. Diane said that was some comfort. Knowing Marcus had been right, knowing his work had led to justice. But it didn't bring him back. It didn't undo the months of not knowing, the nights she'd lain awake imagining scenarios, the moment the police told her they'd found remains. She said grief wasn't linear. It didn't follow a path. Some days she could function, go to work, make dinner, pretend things were normal. Other days she couldn't get out of bed. The weight of Marcus's absence was too heavy. She said the hardest part was the ordinary moments. Reaching for her phone to call him and remembering he wouldn't answer. Making too much food at dinner because she'd forgotten she was cooking for one. Waking up in the middle of the night and reaching across the bed to find it empty. I didn't have words for that. I just listened. She asked me if I thought Joanna and Jeffrey understood what they'd taken from her. If they'd thought about her at all when they were planning, executing, covering up. I said I didn't think they had. I said people like that exist in a kind of tunnel vision. They see their own fear, their own risk, their own need to survive. They don't see the people outside the tunnel. The families, the futures, the decades of life they're erasing. Diane said that made sense. It was the only explanation that fit. Before I left, she gave me something. She said she'd been going through Marcus's things and found a notebook, different from the one that had been torn out in the car. This one had been in his desk at home, tucked into a drawer. She said I should have it. I opened it carefully. The pages were filled with Marcus's neat handwriting, dated entries going back years, observations about client behavior, notes on accounting procedures, reminders to himself about things to follow up on. Near the end, dated 3 days before he disappeared, there was an entry that made my chest tighten. If you're reading this and I'm not around to explain, look in the file cabinet. Bottom drawer, back panel, brass key, 47. Everything you need is there. Trust the evidence. It doesn't lie. People do. Marcus had known. Not that Joanna and Jeffrey would kill him, maybe, but that he was putting himself in danger. And he'd left a message anyway. A clear instruction for whoever came after. I asked Diane if the police had seen this. She said no. She'd found it after the trials were over. She said it didn't matter now, the case was closed. But she wanted me to have it because I'd been the one to follow the trail Marcus had left. I told her I was honored. And I meant it. I kept the notebook. I still have it. Sometimes I flip through the pages, reading Marcus's observations, his careful attention to detail. There's something comforting about his voice, even on paper. Methodical, honest, unafraid of the truth. The last entry, the one dated 3 days before his death, ends with a single line. Do the right thing, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. That was Marcus's code, and he'd lived it until the end. The case officially closed in January. All appeals were exhausted. Joanna and Jeffrey were both serving their sentences in separate facilities. The embezzled money, what could be recovered, was returned to the clients. The firm's assets were liquidated. The office space was leased to new tenants, who had no idea what had happened on the 3rd floor. The local paper ran a retrospective piece, summarizing the case, noting the convictions. My name was mentioned as a contributing investigator. I got calls from other journalists, podcasters, documentary producers. Everyone wanted the story. Everyone wanted to know how it felt to solve a case like this. I turned them all down, because this wasn't about me. It was about Marcus, about a man who'd done his job with integrity and paid for it with his life. About a widow who'd never get to grow old with her husband. About children who'd lost their father. About a community that had learned to lock their doors a little tighter. The brass key, the one found on Marcus's desk, was entered into evidence and stored in the county archives. I asked Brennan if I could see it one more time before the case files were sealed. She arranged it. I held the key in my hand, felt the weight of it, the worn grip, the stamped number. Such a small thing. But it had opened everything. the hidden compartment, the investigation, the truth. I thought about all the keys we carry, literal and metaphorical. The keys to our homes, our cars, our offices. The keys to our secrets, our fears, our vulnerabilities. And I thought about the people who duplicate those keys without permission, who access spaces they shouldn't, who exploit trust for gain. Joanna had made a copy of Marcus's key. But in doing so, she'd also created evidence of her own crime. The mold residue. The duplicate in the car. The proof that she'd planned, prepared, acted with intent. She'd been careful about so many things. But she hadn't been careful enough. None of them had. I returned the key to Brennan. She sealed it back in the evidence bag, logged it and filed it away. She said it would stay in the archives for 75 years, per state law. After that, it would be destroyed. 75 years from now, everyone involved in this case will be gone. Marcus, Diane, Joanna, Jeffrey, Brennan, me. The brass key will outlive all of us, sitting in a box in a climate-controlled room, a silent witness to everything that happened. And then it will be destroyed, melted down, recycled into something new. All that history, all that meaning, reduced to raw metal. I find that both sad and fitting, because that's what happens. Time moves forward, cases close, people forget. Life continues, but the truth remains, documented, archived, waiting for anyone who cares enough to look. Marcus made sure of that. I left the police station that day and drove out to the industrial park where Marcus's body had been found. The demolition was long finished. The rubble had been hauled away. The site was empty now, just bare ground waiting for redevelopment. I stood where the debris field had been, where Jeffrey had buried Marcus under concrete and steel. The earth had been scraped clean by excavators, smoothed by rain, reclaimed by weeds. No marker, no memorial, just empty land. But I could picture it. The van pulling in at night, Jeffrey dragging Marcus's body across the dirt. The panicked burial, the desperate hope that no one would ever find him. And I could picture Marcus, unconscious, dying. His last thoughts unknowable. Had he known what was happening? Had he thought about Diane, his children, the life he was losing? Or had it been quick, merciful, a darkness that came without warning? I hoped for the latter, but I suspected the former. I stood there until the sun began to set, painting the empty lot in long shadows. Then I got in my car and drove home. That night I started writing. Not the article for publication, but something else. A record for myself. A way to process everything I'd seen, everything I'd learned, everything that still sat heavy in my chest. I wrote about the brass key and the locked office and the open window. I wrote about Joanna's calm hands and Jeffrey's calculating eyes. I wrote about Diane's stone face and the notebook entry Marcus had left behind. I wrote about the moment they found his body, the confirmation that he was really gone, the end of hope. And I wrote about the lessons, if there were any. about trust and access and the fragility of safety, about how quickly things can turn, how ordinary people can make monstrous choices, how the line between right and wrong is maintained only by constant vigilance. I wrote until my hands ached and my eyes burned, and when I finished, I saved the file, backed it up, and closed my laptop. I didn't publish it. I didn't share it. It was just for me. A way to mark what I'd witnessed. A way to honor Marcus by telling his story completely, without editorial constraints or word limits. This was the full account. The version that included the doubt and the frustration, and the moments when we almost missed the truth. The version that acknowledged how close Joanna and Jeffrey came to getting away with it. Because they did come close. If Marcus hadn't documented everything. If Joanna hadn't made the duplicate key. If Jeffrey hadn't used the stolen van. If any one of those elements had been different, this case might still be unsolved. Marcus Hillman might still be listed as missing. Joanna and Jeffrey might still be free. And the brass key might still be sitting on a desk somewhere. Its significance unknown. But that's not what happened. Marcus built his case. Joanna made her mistakes. Jeffrey left his traces. And the investigation followed the evidence to its conclusion. That's how it's supposed to work. That's the promise of justice. Not that it always succeeds. Not that it's always timely. Not that it undoes the harm. But that it tries. That it persists. That it refuses to let the truth stay buried. Marcus understood that. It's why he documented everything. Why he built his case carefully, methodically, knowing he might not be there to present it. He trusted that someone would follow the trail. That the evidence would speak. That the truth would survive him. And it did. 3 years after the convictions, I received a letter. It came to my office, forwarded from the newspaper where I'd published the original series. The return address was a correctional facility 2 states over. The sender was Joanna Kress. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. Part of me wanted to throw it away unopened. I'd closed this chapter. I'd moved on to other work, other stories. I didn't want to be pulled back into the darkness of the Hillman case. But curiosity won. It always does. The letter was handwritten, 3 pages on standard lined paper. Joanna's handwriting was neat, almost identical to the penmanship I'd seen in the forum archives. Controlled. Precise. She started by saying she understood if I didn't want to read this, if I threw it away without finishing. She said she'd spent 3 years thinking about what happened, working with a therapist the prison provided, trying to understand how she'd become someone capable of what she'd done. She said she wasn't writing to ask for forgiveness. She knew she didn't deserve it. She wasn't writing to claim innocence or to argue her sentence was too harsh. She'd accepted her guilt. She'd accepted her punishment. She was writing because she wanted me to know something that hadn't come out in the trial. Something she'd never told anyone. Not her lawyer, not the prosecutors, not even Jeffrey. She said Marcus had offered her a way out. The night he confronted her in the office, before Jeffrey arrived, Marcus had laid out what he knew. The embezzlement. the shell company. The pattern of theft over 18 months. He'd shown her copies of his documentation. And then, he'd made her an offer. He said if she confessed fully, if she returned what could be returned and cooperated with authorities, he would advocate for leniency. He would tell the prosecutor she'd come forward voluntarily, that she'd shown remorse, that she deserved a chance to make it right. He wouldn't guarantee she'd avoid prison, but he'd do what he could to minimize the damage. All she had to do was tell the truth. Joanna said she'd almost taken it. She'd sat there in his office, looking at this man who had trusted her for 6 years, who had given her responsibility and autonomy, who was offering her mercy even after she'd stolen from him and his clients. And she'd felt something break inside her. She'd wanted to say yes. She'd wanted to confess, to end the lying, to accept whatever consequences came. She said Marcus's face in that moment was kind. Disappointed, but kind. Like a parent confronting a child who'd made a terrible mistake. But then she thought about Jeffrey, about the plan they'd made, about the money she'd already spent, the apartment she'd rented with stolen funds, the lifestyle she'd built. She thought about prison, about losing everything, and she'd texted Jeffrey instead. Joanna said that moment, that choice, was the one she regretted most. Not the embezzlement, not the planning, not even the cover-up, but the moment she'd looked at Marcus's kind face and chosen to destroy him instead of accepting his mercy. She said she replayed it constantly. What would have happened if she'd said yes? If she'd confessed right then, before Jeffrey arrived? Marcus would still be alive. She'd be in prison, probably, but for a shorter sentence. And she'd be able to live with herself. Instead, she'd texted Jeffrey. And 2 minutes later, everything had spiraled beyond control. Joanna said she wanted me to know this because she felt it was important to Marcus's story. That his last act toward her had been compassion. That he'd given her a chance to save herself, and she'd refused it. That his death hadn't been inevitable, hadn't been the result of some unstoppable force. It had been the result of her choice. She said she thought about that every day. About the man Marcus had been. About the woman she'd been. And the woman she'd become. About whether 3 years in prison had changed her in any meaningful way, or if she was still the person who'd looked at kindness and chosen cruelty. She said she didn't know the answer to that, but she wanted me to tell Diane Hillman, if I was still in contact with her, that Marcus had tried. That his last act had been an attempt at redemption. For her. That even when he knew what she'd done, he'd offered her a path forward. She said she hoped that might bring Diane some small comfort. That Marcus had died trying to save someone. Even someone who didn't deserve it. The letter ended there. No signature, just her inmate number. I read it 3 times. Then I sat with it for a week, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Joanna had no right to ask me to carry her message to Diane. She'd forfeited that right when she'd sent the text to Jeffrey. This felt like absolution seeking, a way to ease her own guilt by framing Marcus's death as somehow noble. But another part of me thought Diane deserved to know. that this detail, this moment of Marcus offering mercy, was consistent with who he'd been, and that knowing he'd tried to save Joanna, even at the end, might matter. I called Diane. We'd stayed in occasional contact, brief emails on birthdays and holidays. I asked if I could visit. She said yes. I drove to her house on a Saturday afternoon. She'd aged in the 3 years since the trial. Her hair had gone mostly grey. The lines around her eyes were deeper. But she still moved with the same quiet strength I remembered. We sat in her living room again, the same room where we'd talked after Jeffrey's sentencing. She made coffee. We exchanged pleasantries about weather and work. And then I told her about the letter. I didn't read it to her verbatim, but I summarized the key point that Marcus had offered Joanna a way out, and she'd refused. Diane was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "That sounds like Marcus." She said it didn't surprise her. Marcus had always believed in second chances. He'd believed people could make mistakes and still be worth saving. She said it was one of the things that had made him a good accountant, a good boss, a good father. He'd seen the best in people, even when they disappointed him. I asked her if it helped, knowing that. She said she didn't know. She said on one level, yes, it confirmed what she'd always known about her husband, that he'd been kind until the end, that he'd tried to do the right thing, even when it put him at risk. But on another level, it hurt, because it meant Joanna had seen that kindness, had been offered a lifeline, and had chosen to kill him anyway. It meant Marcus had died not because of some unavoidable conflict, but because Joanna had valued her comfort over his life. Diane said she didn't think she could forgive that, and she didn't think Joanna had any right to expect her to. I agreed. We talked for another hour. Diane told me she'd started volunteering with a victims advocacy organization, helping families navigate the aftermath of violent crime. She said it gave her purpose, made her feel like Marcus's death hadn't been completely meaningless. If she could help other families avoid the mistakes she'd made, the assumptions and the delays, then maybe something good could come from the tragedy. I told her that was admirable, and I meant it. Before I left, I asked her if she wanted me to respond to Joanna's letter. She thought about it, then said no. She said Joanna didn't deserve a response. She'd said what she needed to say. Diane had heard it. That was enough. I asked if there was anything she wanted me to tell Joanna, if I ever wrote back. Diane said yes. She said to tell Joanna that Marcus's kindness didn't absolve her, that offering someone mercy doesn't make their refusal of it any less damning, that Marcus had been a good man, and he'd died because Joanna had chosen to be a bad person, and no amount of therapy or regret or self-reflection would change that fundamental fact. She said to tell Joanna that she hoped prison was hard, that she hoped every day felt long and empty and full of regret, that she hoped Joanna lived a very long life behind bars, thinking about what she'd done. And then Diane said she was done talking about Joanna Kress. She didn't want to hear her name again. She didn't want updates on her parole hearings or her rehabilitation progress. She wanted Joanna to exist as a closed chapter, a name in a case file, nothing more. I promised her I'd respect that. I never responded to Joanna's letter. I filed it with my case notes, added it to the record, and moved on. But the letter stayed with me. The detail about Marcus offering mercy. The moment when Joanna had chosen differently. Because that's what it comes down to, in the end. Choices. Marcus chose to investigate. To document. To confront. To offer redemption. Joanna chose to steal. To lie. To call Jeffrey. To cover up. Jeffrey chose to come to the office. To bring a weapon. To swing it. To bury the body. Each choice led to the next. Each decision narrowed the possibilities until there was only one path left. Marcus dead. Joanna and Jeffrey in prison. Diane alone. Could it have gone differently? Yes. At a dozen points along the way, someone could have chosen differently. Joanna could have confessed. Jeffrey could have refused to come. Marcus could have gone straight to the police instead of confronting Joanna alone. But they didn't. And so we got the outcome we got. That's the nature of crime. It's not fate. It's not inevitable. It's a series of choices made by people who could have chosen otherwise. And the job of investigation is to trace those choices backward. To find the moments of decision. To understand what happened and why and who bears responsibility. That's what we did in the Hillman case. We followed the brass key. We traced the forum messages. We found the blood evidence. We connected Joanna and Jeffrey. We reconstructed the timeline. We built a case that showed, choice by choice, how a man ended up dead in a demolition site. And then we let the justice system do its work. Imperfect work, maybe. Incomplete in the ways that justice always is. But work, nonetheless. Joanna got 12 years. Jeffrey got 30. Marcus got a grave and a headstone and a widow who volunteers with victims' families. Is that balanced? No. Nothing could balance those scales. But it's what we have. 4 years after the convictions, Detective Brennan died. Heart attack. Sudden, at her home on the coast. She was 63. I attended the funeral. It was small, family, and a few former colleagues. The eulogies focused on her career, her solve rate, her dedication to victims. No one mentioned the Hillman case specifically. But I thought about it. I thought about Brennan in that interview room with Joanna, patient and relentless. I thought about her walking me through the evidence, trusting my instincts even when they seemed like long shots. I thought about the way she'd built the case carefully, methodically, with the same attention to detail Marcus had used in his documentation. Brennan had been good at her job. She'd cared about the truth. She'd refused to let the case go cold, even when the leads dried up, even when it would have been easier to file it as unsolved and move on. Marcus would have appreciated that. After the funeral, I drove back to the city and stopped at the cemetery where Marcus was buried. I hadn't been there in over a year. The grave was well maintained, flowers fresh. Diane still came regularly, I assumed. I stood at the headstone and thought about everything that had happened. The investigation, the trials, the convictions, the letter from Joanna, the conversation with Diane, Brennan's funeral. All of it connected by a single thread. A man who'd done his job with integrity and paid for it with his life. I thought about the notebook entry Marcus had left. Do the right thing, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. That's what he'd done. And that's what Brennan had done. And that's what I'd tried to do, in my own small way. But the world doesn't always reward doing the right thing. Sometimes it punishes you for it. Sometimes it kills you and buries you under rubble, and lets the people who destroyed you walk around free for weeks before they're caught. That's not fair. That's not just. That's just the way it is. And so we build systems. Laws and courts and investigations. Imperfect systems run by imperfect people. But systems that try, at least, to push back against the chaos. To say that some things matter. That some lines can't be crossed without consequence. That the truth is worth pursuing, even when it's buried deep. Marcus believed that. Brennan believed that. And I believe it too. That's why I keep the case file. Why I still pull it out sometimes and read through the timeline, the evidence, the transcripts. Not because I want to relive the investigation, but because I want to remember what it stands for. A man who wouldn't let discrepancies slide. A detective who wouldn't let a case go cold. A journalist who followed the brass key wherever it led. And a truth that survived, documented and preserved, waiting in an archive for 75 years, until it's finally destroyed. By then, everyone will be gone. The victims, the perpetrators, the investigators, the witnesses. All of us just names in a file. A story that happened once. A long time ago before we were reduced to dust. But for now, the story remains. Complete. Recorded. A testament to the choices people made, and the consequences that followed. Marcus Hillman's story. Joanna Kress's story. Jeffrey Soller's story. Detective Brennan's story. And, in a small way, mine. A story about a brass key stamped with the number 47. About a hidden compartment in a locked file cabinet. About a man who documented his own murder investigation before he was killed. About two people who thought they were smarter than the evidence. And about the long, patient work of tracing the truth through blood and fiber and contradictions, until there was nowhere left to hide. That's the Hillman case. That's what happened. And now you know it too. The rain has stopped. The files are closed. The sentences are being served. Marcus Hillman rests in a cemetery under oak trees. His widow volunteers with victims' families. His killers count days in separate prisons. The brass key sits in an evidence room, sealed in plastic, waiting to be destroyed. And I sit here, years later, telling you this story. Trying to make sense of it. Trying to honor the people who did the right thing, even when it cost them. Trying to understand the people who didn't. I don't have any grand conclusions, no tidy moral, no lesson that makes it all make sense. Just this. People make choices. Those choices have consequences. And the truth, when it's documented carefully enough, survives even the people who tried to bury it. Marcus knew that. He built his case knowing he might not live to present it. He trusted that someone would follow the trail, that the evidence would speak, that justice, however imperfect, would eventually arrive. And he was right. Not because the world is fair, not because good always wins, but because some people refuse to let the truth stay hidden, because some investigators follow every lead, because some journalists ask uncomfortable questions, because some prosecutors build careful cases, because some juries listen to evidence. That's the best we can do. Document. Investigate. Prosecute. Remember, and refuse to let the Marcus Hillmans of the world die forgotten, their cases unsolved, their killers unpunished. That's what I tried to do. That's what this story is. A record. A testament. A promise that some deaths matter enough to pursue, no matter how long it takes, no matter how carefully the killers tried to hide their work. Joanna and Jeffrey almost succeeded. They came close. They had a plan. They executed it carefully. They bought time with misdirection and staging. But they made mistakes. Small ones. The kind of mistakes that seem insignificant until an investigator finds them and pulls the thread and watches everything unravel. A fiber caught in a push-bar lock. A shoe print in basement dust. A duplicate key in a car trunk. A forum archive preserved by a third-party service. A gap in cell phone activity. A stolen van captured on traffic cameras. Small mistakes, but enough, because the truth doesn't need much. Just a thread, just a starting point, just one investigator willing to follow it. Detective Brennan was that investigator, and Marcus Hillman gave her the thread, the brass key, stamped with the number 47, opening a hidden compartment, revealing a folder of evidence, starting a chain of investigation that ended with 2 convictions and a body recovered from a demolition site. That's the story. That's what the brass key unlocked. Not just a file cabinet, but the truth, the whole truth. Everything Marcus had documented, everything Joanna and Jeffrey had tried to hide. And now it's recorded, preserved, part of the permanent record, so that when someone asks, years from now, what happened to Marcus Hillman, there will be an answer. Not a mystery, not a cold case, not a name on a missing persons list, but a complete story, with victims and perpetrators, with evidence and convictions, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's what Marcus deserved. That's what we gave him. And that's what I'm giving you now. The full account. Everything I know. Everything I witnessed. Everything that matters. So you'll know. So you'll remember. So Marcus Hillman won't be forgotten. A man who did the right thing. Who documented the truth. Who offered mercy to someone who repaid him with murder. A man who died alone in a van, in an industrial park, far from home, but whose work survived, whose evidence spoke, whose careful documentation led to justice. That's Marcus Hillman. That's his story. And that's why the brass key matters. Not because it's valuable, not because it's rare, but because it unlocked the truth. And the truth, once unlocked, cannot be buried again.